Thank you all for turning out on a wonderful Melbourne spring evening. You put these events on and you hope that a lot of things are going to fall into place, and in Melbourne one of those is that the weather will be kind. It hasn't been, so thank you for making the effort. My name is Peter Kelly, and among other things I'm the Director of the Centre for Education, Training and Work in the Asian Century. And before we begin this public lecture this evening, we want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land on which RMIT stands, and we respectfully recognise elders both past and present. The Centre for Education, Training and Work in the Asian Century is really pleased to host this public lecture by Professor Andy Furlong from the University of Glasgow, on the waterfront at Newcastle apparently, and to invite Stephen Threadgold and David Ferrugia from the Youth Studies group at the University of Newcastle to respond to Andy. And I'll say a little bit more about our guests shortly, but I just want to say a brief introduction to our centre. So our centre's been going since early 2015 and was framed by a sense that we live in an increasingly complex, interconnected and globalised world, and a world that in which digital, biogenetic and nanotechnologies are transforming what it is to be human, what it is to be a learner, to be a teacher, to be a worker, to be a person who consumes, who participates or not in that thing that we call democracy, who makes choices about the life that they would like to live in a world that demands that they develop certain skills and capabilities and behaviours and dispositions so that these things can happen. And a world which selectively makes available or denies access to the opportunities, the resources, the circumstances that promise to equip us to actively engage with the challenges and opportunities of this way of being a person, and which increasingly makes us as individuals responsible for the choices we make under circumstances that are mostly not of our own choosing. And so for our centre, the idea of the Asian century doesn't mean a sole focus on Asian countries or economies or cultures. Instead, it suggests that globalisation and the things that we've been talking about are increasingly driven from these regions, and that the effects are being felt around the world in different ways and with different consequences for our key concerns of education, training and work. Indeed, Australia, the US, the UK and the EU, continue to be much interested, even perplexed by the rise of Asia. And it's in this context that the work of our guests this evening is particularly relevant. And as I said, we're really pleased to have these people with us. Andy is one of the most prominent youth studies researchers in the world, without a doubt. The official type stuff that we would get in his bio will tell you that he is the Dean for Research in the College of Social Science and a Professor of Social Inclusion and Education at the University of Glasgow. He is also an honorary professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne, involved in a large ARC discovery up there at the moment, and this is why he's in Australia for this week. He's a fellow of the Academy of Social Science and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Youth Studies. His research interests are focused on young people and social change, with an emphasis on transitions from education to work and in young people's experiences of rapidly changing labour markets. With Fred Cartmel, Andy has co-authored one of the most influential books in youth studies in the last 20 years, Young People and Social Change, which now is in its second edition, and where they coined one of the most used and possibly abused, but also important terms in youth studies, what they called the epistemological fallacy of late modernity, that lie that social structures and relations no longer shape individual life choices, that young people are free to make a life unencumbered by things such as class or gender, ethnic or geographic background. Less officially, Andy was one of the examiners of my PhD thesis back in 1998, and since then I've had quite a bit to do with him, academically and away from the academy. He, for example, took great pleasure in introducing me at a seminar at the University of Glasgow back in the year 2000 as Father Ted. And I always thought that there would come a time when revenge would be mine, and that revenge is something that's best served cold. You worried?
Maybe.
But that's not going to be tonight. I'm not going to. Quite possibly the Vegas principle. What happens in Vegas should stay in Vegas, should apply on moments like this, so we'll pass over that. If you come to the Queensbury Hotel later on tonight after the event, maybe I'll tell some tales. Stephen Threadgold and David Ferrugia, our respondents tonight, are two of the leading emerging youth researchers in Australia. I said that I would pump up their tyres. If not young researchers, though Andy and I are probably in a different league chronologically. You're older, mate. You got your bus pass. Together with colleagues at the University of Newcastle's Youth Studies Group, where Andy has also been a visitor, there he is, in all his glory. They are doing some really interesting research on such things as young people and social change, identity and belonging, health and wellbeing, geographical and spatial inequalities, and education and work. They're actually doing some of this research in Melbourne at the moment, and we are lucky that we've been able to schedule their activities to be here tonight. Steve's research interests, for example, focus mainly on inequality in youth, especially the interplay between class, risks and governmental discourses. Some of his recent research projects have investigated the recruitment and experiences of young Balinese in the global cruise ship industry and the emergence of DIY subcultural careers. His latest work analyses the way figures such as the hipster and the bogan evoke ideas of class without explicitly talking about or referencing class, because after all, Australia is a classless society. Right, Steve? Dave, who's current... and I was speaking to him about his privilege there before. He's owning his privilege, as my daughter would say that I need to do. Dave currently holds an Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Researcher Award for a 3-year project titled The Formation of Young Workers, a multi-sided study on the periphery. The project is examining key social changes connected with the geographical distribution of work, with a focus on regional economies and the changes in relationships between young people and work, and the role that work plays in their lives. This project in part develops earlier work on the affective attachments that young people have or do not have to the rural and regional spaces in which they grow up. So we have a panel tonight that's doing some really interesting, innovative and high impact research in the field of youth studies. Andy's going to speak for about 40 minutes, then Steve and Dave will each get about 10 minutes to pick up on some of the themes that Andy introduces, but also to introduce their own work. Finally, tonight's event is a co-production of our centre and the youth work program at RMIT. The manager of that program is Dr. Kerry Montero. Kerry and I have worked together for a number of years, and after our guests have spoken this evening, Andy, who's the editor of the Routledge series Youth, Young Adulthood and Society, will launch our new book in that series, Young People, here's one we prepared earlier, Young People and the Aesthetics of Health Promotion, Beyond Reason, Rationality and Risk. So hopefully you can last a distance on that. Would you join me in welcoming Andy Furlong?
Thank you. Thanks, Peter, for a welcome. Thanks for Peter and Kerry for inviting me here. Always a pleasure to be over here in Melbourne, and maybe to minimise the damage later, I'll say that I don't think Peter looks anything like Father Ted anymore. It's that Serbian guy I caught last time, but maybe we will not go there anywhere. That'll only kind of make things worse. Okay, what I want to do this evening is talk about changes in the labour market for young people over the past. Get my slides right. Didn't even realise they weren't there. I want to talk about young people's experiences in the labour market over the last 30 or 40 years to try and put some of these changes in perspective. And I think where Steve and Dave will come on, I'll sort of hopefully take us quite nicely on from that. So what these differences I'm talking today kind of really broadly reflect the differences in the world that I encountered, or Peter encountered on leaving school, and the worlds that young people today are entering. I'm going to draw on work in a new book published later this year with my colleagues John Goodwin, Henrietta O'Connor et al. And give you sort of a bit of a flavour of that. I'm going to do it really with trying to get rid of the sort of theoretical angle, because I know this is a fairly general audience, so I don't want to kind of get people sort of bogged down in the theory. I'd rather provide a nice overview of changes. Now, a lot of the evidence that I'm drawing on, which is from the book here, is based on a couple of projects that were undertaken in the UK. And I think although chronologies may differ slightly, and though there may be differences in policy context between here and the UK, what I'm going to suggest really is that much of what I've got to say tonight, drawing on UK evidence, is equally relevant to Australia. The broad trends, anyway, if not the precise timings, and I'm sure Steve and Dave I'll be quick to correct me if I'm wrong on any of those assumptions. Okay, we know we don't have to look very far to know that young people today face a whole wide range of problems in the labour market, ranging from unemployment, underemployment, fragmented and unpredictable opportunities in the gig economy, declining relative wage rates, etc., etc. I'll look at some of these in a little while. For many young people, for many people generally, for many people in this audience, when we think about the situations faced by young people today, they often have in mind their own experiences, or perhaps even some kind of golden era when jobs were much more plentiful, much more traditional, much more predictable, etc., and try and measure up young people's experiences against that benchmark. A very influential UK sociologist, Ken Roberts, who many of us in the room all know well, wrote a foreword for the book that I'm talking about here, and in the foreword he describes his early years in the labour market before he moved into academia. And I think they set the scene nicely by taking us back to a past era that was quite different. And I'll read verbatim from the short passage from Ken there. He said, there really was a golden age when smooth and rapid school-to-work transitions were the norm. I left school in that era. This was at age 16 in 1957, when I was offered a job in every bank and insurance company to which I applied. In spring 1961, I quit the bank where I'd spent nearly 4 years, having been accepted at university. I wanted an immediate boost to my pay. So the Monday after leaving the bank, I started working in a factory that manufactured floor tiles. The work was tedious and heavy, as were many jobs at that time. And we worked more hours per day than we did in the bank. We worked overtime into early evening and on Saturday mornings whenever it was offered. The extra hours were paid at normal rates plus 50%. But it was tough, so I quit. And the following day started work in the dispatch department of a confectionery factory. These jobs paid an adult wage irrespective of age, unlike the bank, which had a very strong incremental salary. My pay was 50% higher without overtime doing the manual job than it was working in the bank. If you first entered the labour market in the 50s, 60s, even the 70s, certainly up to the mid-70s, you probably recognise some of that, if not quite precisely that kind of severe buoyancy that Ken talks about. You probably recognise the broad picture. But I think let's not over-romanticise this kind of idea of a golden age that perhaps existed up until this time. First of all, educational opportunities were pretty restricted. University entry wasn't for the masses. University entry was very much an elite experience. There were severe forms of race and gender discrimination, and women's wage rates were normally much lower than for men, even when they were doing exactly the same job. Now, Ken Roberts may have been content to spend a bit of time working in manual jobs, which he admitted were tough, before university, but to spend a lifetime in these kind of jobs was quite a different proposition. I think we also need to remember that although it may have been easy to secure full-time jobs in the 60s, conditions in these firms were often very hard. Industrial accidents, even fatalities, were much more common than they are today, and it was young inexperienced workers who were much more prone to industrial accidents than older workers. Also, young workers and apprentices were effectively treated like children. They were subject to what we would clearly see today as workplace bullying. Their parents often took their wage packet off them and gave them pocket money. In return, they didn't have anything like the same kind of freedoms that we might talk about today. Male apprentices were often referred to as the boy. They were the butt of a constant stream of practical jokes. Here's a little quote from a study by Sarah Bickerstaff looking at a young apprentice in that era. He said, "It was the worst 6 years of my life. Every morning I used to dread getting up and going into this place. It was name-calling, taking the mickey, long streak of piss and all this sort of thing, because I was only 10.5 stone and already 6'3". I became a nervous wreck in a way, and I never told my mum and dad about it because you didn't." So despite being thought of as a kind of hippie era, sort of the era of dropping out, free love, etc., the 60s and 70s, effectively were a much less tolerant era where, for most, there was relatively little scope to develop alternative lifestyles. The labour market was very heavily segmented, and if, unlike Ken, you started your working life in a factory, you probably remained in that kind of work for the rest of your life. Now, while many we may question the economic payoffs of mass higher education, there's no doubt that extended participation in education has opened up some new horizons. Let's jump from the 60s and 70s to the present day. Okay, what's happening in Europe? In Europe, we're still suffering from the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Many parts of Europe, such as Greece and Spain, particularly badly affected, and while other countries, like Australia, Germany, etc., escaped a little bit more lightly. So unemployment rates among young people have fallen back a bit since the recession, but they're still very high. In Greece and Spain, they're still only a whisker under 50%, and in much of Northern Europe, rates stand between 10 and 15%. In the UK, it's about 15% at the moment, which is quite similar to the picture in Australia. We also know that unemployment rates for young people are always double or triple the all-age rate. We also know that the unemployment rate actually isn't a very accurate indicator of young people's employment prospects. If we look more broadly at the NEET rate, for example, the numbers of people not in education, employment or training, then we see we start to sweep the net over a lot more people. There's also a lot, we must also remember, there's a lot of underemployment, people working for fewer hours than they want or need, and many highly qualified young people who are working in routine minimum age jobs. And this tends not to make headlines. The unemployment rate makes a nice headline. A lot of the other tends to be swept underneath the radar. So focusing on the unemployment rate is always going to significantly underplay the employment related difficulties that are encountered by young people. In many countries, including Australia, wage rates for young people relative to older workers have been falling for some time. Many young people are working part-time hours, and unless they're managing to juggle several part-time jobs with all the difficulties that entails, then they're likely to be existing on part-time wages. Other workers have, kind of whole range of varied range of contractual arrangements that characterize employment in the so-called gig economy. So descriptions of experiences in the gig economy, they make good headlines with commentary that highlights the negative, as well as looking at it from another perspective, some of the positive aspects of work in the new economy. Let's take 0 hours contracts. 0 hours contract means that an employer makes no guarantee to an employee about how many hours they'll be offered in a given week or month. And as the term implies, it can be none. Now this leaves the worker, and typically they are young workers, in a state of uncertainty. So 1 week they may be offered no hours, the next week they might get 10, the next week they'll get 30, etc. And of course, no guaranteed hours means no guaranteed pay. But of course it gets worse than this. Because some 0 hours contracts, and this is the case in the UK, forbid employees from working for other firms. And even if it isn't specifically contractually forbidden to work for other firms, the hours that people get may be just so unpredictable, both in terms of number and in terms of the way in which the hours are spread across a given week, that it's virtually impossible to take another job, even if you're not getting by on the hours that you're being offered. Employers also put a lot of pressure on young people to accept work, often at short notice, even when it conflicts with other commitments, because they simply often restrict future offers of hours to those who've turned down work on a particular occasion as a form of punishment. Another form of work that's on the increase is that which is sometimes referred to as bogus self-employment. In the UK, this used to be particularly prominent in the building industry, but it's now one of the biggest growth areas are in services for young people working with these bogus contractual self-employed arrangements. So workers in these companies, such as Deliveroo here, tend to be classed as self-employed and therefore denied employee benefits such as sick pay, holiday pay, minimum wage protection, etc., even though in reality they have very little control over working conditions and are certainly not able to negotiate their own contracts. So Deliveroo here, which now operates in Australia, classes its what it calls its delivery operatives as independent contractors, and it pays them $10 per delivery. And what some operators argue is that while it may be possible to make the minimum wage through this system at peak hours, actually outside of peak hours during the day, during a lot of the time that they're needing to get work, that they have absolutely no chance of getting anywhere near the minimum wage. So companies like Uber, Deliveroo, etc., really present themselves as part of this new wave in which, as the advert shows here, it's a different logo, obviously, on the words for the traditional advert, they kind of present themselves as being able to provide new freedoms to young people. The young people are able to choose the hours they work and work in ways that allow them to focus on their chosen lifestyles and determine the way in which work fits into their lives, rather than have this kind of predetermined, pre-structured 9 to 5, no flexibility, whatever. So how do we make sense? How do we make sense of all this? On the one hand, we could argue that the current state of employment for young people is poor and deteriorating. On the other hand, we might want to argue that new forms of working are emerging that offer very new and welcome opportunities for young people to make a life outside of what were the traditional constraints. I think probably you'll get my take on it by looking at the illustration, but we'll take you through the arguments anyway. So your reaction to this, which side of this fence that you fall on, probably depends on your age and your past experiences. And if you're the wrong side of 50, then there's a very strong likelihood that you regard the current state of affairs negatively in relation to your own experiences, and may wonder how it's possible for young people to make a fulfilling life under such unpredictable and precarious conditions. Now, there's something of a tendency for young people, a tendency for people generally to think of insecurity and unpredictability of life in late modernity as something that's a fairly recent phenomena. Some people and some writers who sort of bind it all up with discussions of the global financial crisis. What I want to argue really is that what we're seeing is the culmination of long-term trends. And importantly, because it's the culmination of long-term trends, we can't argue that this is some fleeting thing that's been triggered by a very specific, very unusual set of events and is going to go away. If we can establish the roots go back decades, then I think it gives us a clue about what the future trajectory may be and about what we need to do about it. Some still refer to this kind of past era that Ken was talking about as the golden age, and however skeptical we are about the overall validity of these terms, in many developed countries, the labour market and welfare policies actually did change very fundamentally around the late 1970s and early 80s. I mean, we can argue that there's roots behind there, but there was certainly a new momentum in policy and practice around this time that's really set the scene for today. So, depending on the country you're looking at, in the UK, this period in time was a period when there was a huge shift from industrial to a service economy, accelerated with a very significant loss of jobs in industry, especially in heavy industry, mining, etc. So from the 1970s onwards, manufacturing in the UK was eroded with a huge reduction in output and jobs, and significantly, in this era, there was a huge fall of apprenticeships linked to a decline in the traditional industries that had provided skilled jobs for young people. Economic uncertainty at the time, new sources of competition, industrial restructuring led to a very significant rise in unemployment from throughout the 70s and in through the 80s recession. Youth unemployment rose from a figure of close on 2% at the early 70s to 15% by 1980, and that's before we start to hit the 1980s recession. Within this, long-term unemployment, which used to be fairly rare, doubled in this period. So coming after a long period of virtually full employment, rising levels of youth unemployment from the late 70s onwards, was very visible, and it led to calls for political action. It was shocking. It was something new, something that hadn't been experienced in recent years, and to an extent fueled calls for political action. In fact, there were also kind of very clear moral panics linked to prevalent youth cultures in the 60s and 70s that led to this kind of vocal concern about idle hands. In a sense, government intervention in this period was essentially linked to fears about levels of hooliganism, delinquency, etc., which was seen as triggered by unemployment. Now, the government's response was to launch the first in a long series of training schemes, none of which, and I say underline none, could be judged to be effective in any way. And the earliest were really established as kind of holding schemes. There was a belief that once we were over the recession, things would get back to normal, people would get back into jobs. So it was just really to keep people off the streets until things picked up again. But subsequently, there came a greater appreciation that we were going through a big period of industrial restructuring. So the interpretation was being challenged, and the emphasis then suddenly shifted to the idea that that unemployment was structural, linked to changing patterns of demand, and therefore there was various skills deficits that needed to be addressed in young people if we were ever going to get back to a situation of full employment. And as a response to this, as you see the kids protesting there, the government introduced, first of all, the Youth Opportunities Programme, which effectively marked a real sea change in transitions, in opportunities, and triggered huge negative reactions of young people who were effectively forced to go on these forced labour programmes with very, very, very poor prospects at the end. So it became a sea change. To give you an idea of the magnitude, in Britain in the early 80s, around 700,000 young people moved from school to the labour market each year. 700,000. At the peak of the recession, 550,000 of them were entering this programme, which, as they can say, YTS is a load of shit. You can see the reaction to it, and you can understand the reaction, because the benefit culture that existed prior to then, when periods of unemployment were fairly short-lived, tended to be a fairly sympathetic benefit culture in which there were, very clear assumptions about entitlements. I mean, to put that into context, in the UK, there was actually even a claimants union for people on the dole to sort of fight to improve their conditions. Such was the feelings of entitlement. Now, the introduction of these youth training schemes really marked a whole new era for youth benefits, although there was no evidence before that of any particular abuse of the system. So it kind of came from nowhere. From now on, and we can see this in current approaches to welfare, from here in, young people were expected to demonstrate their willingness to work by taking part in a whole range of programs without any financial gain, without being provided with any quality training, and without any evidence that participation and conformity to these schemes would do anything to improve their future prospects. So, undoubtedly, clearly led to widespread resentment among young people who described the schemes as slave labour or worse. They basically begrudged working for an employer who made no contribution towards their allowance, made no commitment to offer them paid work in the future, and provided them with very little in the way of credible training or skills development. But beginning in here, this is important, because beginning here, but intensifying hugely under later schemes, punitive regimes were increasingly being implemented whereby refusal of a placement, even if travel was difficult, even if the placement that you were offered showed absolutely no respect for your interests or qualifications, led to sanctions in the form of benefit withdrawal. A relatively sympathetic system of support for young people without jobs had been transformed into one that was underpinned by suspicion and sanctions, a move that we refer to as the punitive turn in welfare policy. The 70s, with the, let's say 79, with the election of Thatcher, politics took a radical swing to the right, introducing industrial and employment policies that would effectively provide the basis for future precarious forms of employment. Other countries taking similar political turns, Reagan, Hawke, Keating, we can sort of see the politics unravel. And as recession set in during the 80s, we saw an acceleration of these trends, an acceleration of these responses. And as a consequence, young people started to look for alternatives to moving into opportunities that were regarded as pretty miserable. So young people started to regard education as a refuge from a difficult labour market. But the government also learned that pushing young people into education and training was a very effective way of reducing the politically sensitive unemployment rates. So the reality for the majority of workers leaving school at the age of 15 and 16 in the UK and elsewhere in the industrial economies was the prospect of transition. The prospect for them of transitioning into one or two full-time paid forms of paid employment for a reasonable length of time had pretty well gone. The trend also kicked in at the time, and it's often not picked up on, the way in which the increase in young people in part-time working really started to kick in, not in the 90s and the 2000s, but in the 80s. Employers increasingly began to substitute part-time work, temporary work, etc., for what were once provided as permanent opportunities. And there were a range of things that facilitated that, not simply the policy, but even in shops, the introduction, the widespread introduction of electronic tills, for example, allowed employers to sort of look at the peaks and troughs of demand throughout the day and start to think, well, actually, what do we need workers for at this part and this part when we can work with skeleton staffs across there? So the trend had significant implications, and the pressure on workers gradually to take non-standard forms of employment was really compounded by the rising youth unemployment against this kind of backdrop of a punitive welfare system. Now, while the parents of the young people entering the labour market in the 70s had grown up in a period of relative affluence, relative employment stability, young people were now having to negotiate a very different set of circumstances from those experienced by their parents. So whereas their parents had made transitions within relatively tight parameters on both objective and subjective levels, for their children who left school in the 70s onwards, the negotiation of pathways, many of which were new, had started to become much more confusing, much more complex. The old roadmaps had become unhelpful. The signs were much more difficult to interpret, and parents were far less able to provide any effective guidance. So we also have, as I said before, at this time, a kind of growth of educational participation, a huge increase in participation in the upper secondary school, the opening up of opportunities in higher education. And relatively successful to the extent to which there's been more or less continual growth in educational participation across the OECD countries, and now very, very, very few people leave without completing at least upper secondary education. So on a societal level, educational policies have helped limit unemployment by reducing the numbers of young people who are exposed to the labour market. Well, on an individual level, clearly time spent in education clearly decreases the likelihood of unemployment and can open up some economic and social horizons. From the mid-80s to around 2008, to around the start of the global financial crisis, there was a period of relative stability. However, this period of low volatility came to a very abrupt end with the global shockwaves that are linked to the subprime loan crisis in the US and the collapse of institutions such as Lehman's in the autumn of 2008. And those young people below the age of 18 were particularly badly hit in many parts of Northern Europe, but also people in slightly older age groups. Now, unemployment, as I said earlier, has fallen off slightly since the recession ended. We still find, despite this huge growth in education, despite this huge growth in higher education, we still find that young people are still heavily concentrated in the low-skill sectors of the labour market. So among 16 to 24-year-olds in the UK, more than 7 in 10 work in elementary occupations such as waitressing, catering assistants, sales, customer services, etc. These are the growth areas in the economy. And drawing from the UK labour force surveys, Goose and Manning have argued that the trend shows the growth of what they call lousy jobs over what they refer to as lovely jobs. Lousy jobs being defined statistically as those with low median wages, such as care workers, catering assistants, etc. So effectively what we've got is an expansion of well-qualified young people, many of whom hold university degrees, in an economy where the expansion is occurring at the lower end of the skills spectrum. So in post-recession UK, with real political sensitivities about the extent to which austerity measures, unpopular austerity measures, are actually able to promote economic growth, the government's keen to show, they are working because we've got a growth in the number of jobs in the economy. But when you look at the types of jobs that are created, the story looks very different. So the Trades Union Congress showed that only 6 in 10 new jobs are employee positions, while 3 in 10 new jobs are part-time. Indeed, between the summer of 2010 and the end of 2012, nearly 8 in 10 of these new jobs created were in low-paid industries, and a lot of them offered on a part-time basis. So as a consequence, there's been a huge increase in the numbers of people working in jobs for which they're overqualified. Poor job prospects, qualification inflation have encouraged young people to remain in education in the hope that in the long term they can access interesting jobs in the more secure sectors of the labour market. The evidence actually shows that many graduates are failing to get a foothold in the graduate labour market. In the UK, 3.5 years after graduation, 1 in 4 remain in low-skilled jobs. So this expansion in part-time jobs among young people has fueled this kind of growth in underemployment, in which those young people who would love to work full-time have very little option but to accept part-time jobs. This kind of jeopardization of labour, as Robert Castell calls it, has also been accelerated by effectively the abdication of the state from the sphere of labour regulation, through the privatisation of so-called activation measures, through the lens of suspicion with which it views young people. In terms of regulation, the old legislative protections have gradually been stripped away, and there's been a total failure to legislate to protect workers who are exposed to new conditions such as 0 hours contracts. Privatisation of training for young people has led to industries which basically thrive on being able to churn people through subsidised training back on the dole and back through the training programmes again, with very little financial incentive to move them on into stable approaches. And linked to that, on the other side, finally, an approach to young people. We have an approach to young people who suffer the misfortune to become unemployed that regards them with suspicion as work-shy parasites to be battered into submission by a punitive and unsympathetic system. And at best, such a system is totally counterproductive. So the ways in which governments across the way have responded to various crises of employment and to the needs of vulnerable individuals has always been less than adequate. And policy's been framed on the assumption that improvements can be brought about by tackling an assumed deficit in the human capital possessed by young people, rather than addressing the very significant problems of demand that they should be addressing. So the treatment of young people here, the treatment we've seen across this era, is directly linked to the neoliberal agenda and to the shift from collectivist to individualist perspectives. And citizens who push back against this agenda are faced with extremely harsh sanctions and ham-fisted attempts to force them to work within a policy agenda which many young people recognise as being totally irrelevant to the worlds in which they inhabit. The trends I've talked about, to sum up, are not without their consequences. Certainly there's a considerable concern about the mental health and well-being of young people, and which is really unsurprising, as there's a wealth of evidence suggesting alarming levels of mental health among young people and declines in well-being that can quite clearly be linked to experiences in the labour market and to the policies that we bring in to address the so-called needs of young people. In particular here, and I think Dave and Steve might flesh this out in a slightly different way, particularly significant is the ontological insecurities that arise as young people negotiate uncertain terrains in contexts where blame for failure rests with individuals, even though they followed the best advice available, invested heavily in their own futures, etc. So if you accept the argument that the current difficulties faced by young people are not part of a fleeting turmoil being experienced in the wake of a global financial crisis, but a clear trends which have very, very deep roots, this is suggestive clearly of a future trajectory which will see insecure and fragmented forms of employment continue to grow. And if we accept that, then I think we need to consider the implications for the lives of both young and the not so young in future decades. So in the gig economy, people have to build their lives in new ways, both objectively and as they seek to establish an accepted financial base to keep a roof over their heads, food in their mouths, etc., as well as subjectively as they try and create a sense of normality and personal control that are central to establishing a sense of well-being. Now, a shift away from material culture, I think we'll hear some about this in a bit, is a possible response to this, and there's already some evidence that young people are choosing this path. Of course, a mass move in this direction undermines the whole capitalist economy, driven by the consumption of unnecessary goods and services. And so, although not yet implemented in a major economy, the idea, which is gaining ground in some parts of the world, of providing all citizens with a living allowance that they would then supplement with employment, the unconditional basic income, is something that's gaining ground. And one of the messages I think that comes across from this research is a move from policies underpinned by punitive measures has to be replaced by a much more permissive approach in order to stimulate the sorts of creative approaches to life management in an era which is increasingly characterized by diverse pathways. Approaches to policy that are fit for purpose in the contemporary era are really best framed in a bottom-up fashion. In other words, they need to be flexible enough to help young people on their own terms, to assist them in their own efforts to create the life that they want to establish for themselves, be that one that's strongly work-centred or one that's got a much stronger focus on relationships and leisure. I opened this evening with a quote from Ken Roberts, and I think it's probably appropriate that I close with another quote from Ken Roberts, again from the foreword, where he admits that the main lesson he's learned from looking back is that he didn't foresee the last 50 years. So commenting on life today, Ken finishes by saying, "This era will not last forever. We've not reached the end of history, but at present it's impossible to foresee how and when the end will come. We need ideas with which to build a new political generation. We need an escape plan from neoliberalism and a vision of an alternative future. Hopefully one that returns full employment to the top of the economic policy agenda. This squeeze will be heavily constrained, and the liminal zones in Britain's labour market for job seekers of all ages will be squeezed. We need to empty what are really expensive waiting rooms currently designated as education and training." I'll finish there with a quote from Castell, which you might like to take on an opinion on the trends. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. We'll have a chance to follow up with some questions from Andy. But next up, Steve. You ready to go, Steve? Quite possibly we'll add something to those thoughts.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks a lot for coming. It's a pleasure to be able to respond to Andy, who is a real influence on our field and has been a big influence on my work, particularly my PhD work with young people and their attitudes towards the future. I don't have a lot of disagreement with what Andy was just saying. I suppose what I plan to do here is to maybe sketch out some of the ways that young people are actually dealing with this what I'm calling precarity. So I'm drawing here on a number of projects, the one that me and Dave are here in Melbourne to do at the moment, which is about the effective labour that young people working in bars are doing. I suppose examples of those lousy jobs that Andy labelled them, but what we're finding is they don't actually see them as lousy jobs. In fact, there's all kinds of pleasure involved in those jobs. And Dave will talk about this a bit more in a minute, but an anecdote that a guy told us yesterday is a guy did a second master's degree to avoid getting a good job. He was enjoying himself that much working in the bar industry. He worked for 10 years in that, he was having all kinds of fun. His parents were trying to make him get a real job, so to placate them, he did another master's degree so he could keep working in bars. Another one I'm drawing on, just talking a little bit about education there, with Penny Jane Burke about, more people going to uni than ever before, yet inequality is, if anything, widening. So what's going on there? So we're doing a kind of some research about the ways that young people take their experiences and their skills and qualifications for university out into the labour market and the various inequalities involved in that, I suppose. What I'm drawing on today is research I've been doing in Brisbane, Newcastle, Sydney and Melbourne with young people in underground music scenes. I'll refer to that now as like a punk scene. And I've been doing research in that scene about the meanings that they're creating, their creativity and all that kind of thing, but also in the ways that in this world, the ways that they're trying to maintain space in their lives, both in terms of time and mental and all kinds of stuff, to be able to be creative. So I'll show you some examples of that. So Andy sketched out much of the kind of, I suppose the landscape that young people are dealing with, increasingly underemployed, this upward credentialising, unemployed stats are fudged by the very idea that if you work for an hour, you're employed. So there's been a whole lot of research in our field of youth studies about the ways that what we call youth transitions has found, that blurry zigzag transition where it's kind of 2 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of thing. Some really interesting concept here is that it seems that many young people have a different conception of a job and a career. A job is something they're doing now to get by, for pay the rent and to eat food or whatever, where they have a kind of longer term notion of a career. And here we can see almost somewhat of an acceptance of those kind of ways that we almost expect now young people to have a lousy job before they get the lovely job. I was expecting Andy to talk about the precarious, Guy Standing's work, which we've talked about before, which I agree with Andy's critique that it's not really a good idea to think about it as a class. But I'm really interested in thinking about the idea of precarity as a kind of affective structure. And I'm following lots of people's work here, including Jane Kenway's work about the pointing of the knowledge economy, and Judith Butler writes about this, and you can think about this in terms of affective atmospheres. And this, I think, affects most people in the labour market today, not just young people and not just disadvantaged young people. I've had a full-time job in a university now for 6 years and I don't feel that safe. There's all kinds of ways that I could lose my job in KPIs and all that kind of thing. So precarity seems to be something that colours the labour market very broadly. It's something that all people have to deal with, not just the disadvantaged. So I've been kind of thinking about how do we deal with this, what ways we can consider to see what young people do in their day-to-day lives, and I'm using the idea of struggle, and particularly Bourdieu's idea of struggle. I've taken most Bourdieu out of this, so I'm just going to talk about it in broader terms. I think the idea of struggle in this precarity can help us think about the way that young people are making all kinds of strategic choices. They know the lay of the land. They're not they don't have a false consciousness. They're not cultural dupes. They know what's going on, and they're reflexively making all kinds of decisions to try and make do and carve out a space for themselves. They know they're affected by things beyond their control, and they just kind of have to deal with that and get on with it. So the scene that I'm looking at are a whole bunch of young people in bands, and they're artists, and they have their own record labels, and they put on gigs, very broad amount of creative activity. They definitely don't consider themselves creatives. In fact, they find that term itself a form of symbolic violence. They associate that with hipsters. These guys are kind of see themselves as alternative, underground, outside of all that. So ironically though, they often end up kind of doing, gigs, the gig economy kind of thing, in that as well. And I mean gigs there by not only playing music for companies, but also then having to sometimes do work for those companies. So there's all kinds of ways that this has been conceived of. The creative industries in particular have been theorised about new forms of labour. Free labour, immaterial labour, effective labour, that I'll leave Dave to talk about that. For the most part, the young people I'm talking to know this. They know that the creative industries are very exploitative. They know they're going to be working 0-hour contracts. So they're kind of trying to be creative outside of the creative industry, to have a DIY culture, to do it themselves, and try and maintain some kind of punk ethos. So here that importantly here too, what I want to kind of show here is that in youth studies there's been youth transitions on the one side and youth culture studies on the other. We kind of think of young people are doing stuff to get jobs and relationships over here. They're doing their leisure practices over here. What this research shows is that quite often young people bring an ethos or an ethic from their leisure practices in to make decisions about their careers. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. So here, this is a quote from some of the interviews I've been doing. So this is from someone I'm calling Fanny. She talks about how... Okay, so I'll just sketch out the kind of group a bit more. All the people I'm talking about here have gone to university. If they haven't finished their degree, they're very close. A couple of them have had professional careers, working for unions. I think one was started to be a lawyer. And what I'm finding is that when these guys that have the kind of been creative in this scene, they opt out of the rat race pretty quickly. They're almost having a sea change kind of thing in their mid-20s. They'll cut back to 2 days a week rather than working the 60-hour or 40-hour week or whatever they've been doing in their professional jobs, simply because they couldn't find time to invest themselves in the things they really cared about, which was their band, their art, or whatever. So here you have people giving up $120,000 a year jobs to, find time to do stuff that they really care about. So here she talks about how, she's just cut back from 5 days a week to 2 days a week in a job. My main modus operandi now is to keep the overheads low. That came up a lot. Fix everything yourself. You can see the DIY ethic there. Keep payments low, and then I can be afforded to do the things I really enjoy. Opposed to the worst version of myself, which is having a full-time job. Then you're just afforded more freedom to be happy. So here she talks about how she wants space in her life to be creative, rather than to kind of have the drudgery of everyday work. So I'm finding here in some ways, and I'm a little bit kind of bothered myself about the term that I'm choosing there, because I think it's kind of somewhat symbolically violent to people that are experiencing poverty. But these guys are, in a sense, choosing poverty. They're living way below the poverty line. Some of them are earning about 15 grand a year, maybe. They live in big share houses and all that kind of stuff. And they're accepting that. They're accepting that material decline for a more kind of, satisfying life, I suppose, to put it in very general terms. So this is Debbie. Debbie talks about how, it's shit working in a share house, but I've worked in a high-stress job as a trade union official. I had a lot more money, but in terms of having the space to make music, the things that I like, the payoff, not having that much money is better for me at the moment. Either I'm going to end up 40, I think she was about 28 when I had this interview, I'm going to end up burn out and not be able to produce shit, or I'm just going to have to live within small means. And then she tells me, and again, thinking about punk kind of anarchist kind of spirit here, I steal a lot. I'm really good at it, and it kind of helps me get by. I like working and living off crumbs, op-shop living, concentrating on getting better and playing songs and stuff. Now, within 6 months of doing this, her band's toured overseas, they've released a record and all that kind of stuff. As I said, they try and stay out of the creative industries, but end up kind of being sucked into it sometimes as well. And so this is Jemima. At the moment, she's working, nearly a full-time job as a chef, but that's because she just had a couple of months off with her band touring around Europe. So she comes back, she's in debt. But she's also taking up 2 internships at once to try and get her foot in the door into the art scene in particular. It's so brutal. I need to get out of debt after touring. And I've been working at the art gallery for free, doing stuff for their website. I've got another internship starting at another art centre. I'd love to have a paid job. Now, I've actually stopped asking this question because it's actually a brutal question because, do you think this will end up being a full-time job? And every time I ask that, there's this moment where we look at each other in shared kind of knowledge that it's very unlikely. But then they'll say, yeah, I hope so, let's see what happens. It's not certain. So there's a whole lot of free labour going on in this scene as well. Lastly, just to kind of sketch out the punk ethos and career thing, this is who I'm calling Regan. Regan's in a quite prominent band in the scene. She's trained as a jeweller. I've been working in a kind of prominent brand name jewel house for maybe 8 years, but was increasingly getting down on it, didn't like what was going on there. Then she found out a couple of years ago that the diamonds I had were blood diamonds, so she just got out of there. So now I've got this little jewellery studio at home, so that feels as punk to me as playing in a band or anything. The last job I had was really stressful, made me feel like I'm not very DIY punk, so she opts out. Not very good for my psyche. This is the time to get out. It feels kind of silly to throw it in the bin, or that kind of investment of herself into that career, but now that I'm making my own stuff now, and career-wise, I feel like I built it up, so I don't even really want it anymore. So, just to sum up. Here I kind of want to problematise the idea of kind of choice here, and so I'm writing here against the ways that young people are often positioned, not as much in literature, in the youth studies literature, but very generally that they're kind of on the right. They're the kind of anthropological monster of Homo economicus, making rational choices and all that kind of thing. Then on the left, they're kind of positioned. Actually, I just did a George Bush there, I went right and left. So they're the kind of false conscious cultural dupe that don't know what's good for them and all that kind of stuff. I think that doesn't really work to understand anyone's lives. And I think the young people that I talk to really know about the material conditions and the state of precarity, and they're kind of dealing with it the best way they can to kind of create a satisfying life. So in some ways you can point here that, you know, these guys are kind of creating a somewhat traditional bohemian lifestyle, but I think, you know, this is as a result of trying to kind of, you know, deal with that precarity and have some kind of satisfaction of it. So there's certainly, you know, that Borgerian idea of making a virtue out of necessity. And there's also some interesting ways of thinking about what subcultures do here, that we've imagined subcultures in the past as kind of arts of resistance, where maybe we need to think of them more as arts of existence. These guys have very different ideas of what it means to be successful, that is kind of the stereotype of, you know, they're buying a big house and a good car and, you know, having brand names and all that kind of stuff. They're kind of opting out of that thing. To paraphrase Clive Hamilton, they're kind of opting out of that kind of run-of-the-mill stuff where, you know, you go into debt to buy a shit you don't need to impress people that you don't like. So these guys are living an ethical and creative life is really important to them. These things trump material concerns. And they have kind of ambivalent attitudes towards the future, and I don't really have to go time in that, but they're kind of hopeful about it. They're not sure whether this is sustainable. They're not sure whether it's a mistake to opt out of the profession that they've been told from 5 years old that it's something you should strive for. But they want to invest themselves in the stuff that they're passionate about. Okay, thanks. I'll leave it there.
Thanks for that, Steve. And our final presenter tonight, Dave Ferrugia, will pick up on, as Steve indicated, a number of these themes. We will have time for questions for all three of the presenters at the end of David's talk, so sitting there listening to what's being discussed here and thinking of some really challenging questions. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, thanks, Peter. First of all, apologies for my voice. I didn't talk at all day so that I could have 10 minutes of voice left remaining to do this. So I hope that I can be heard. Peter invited us to respond, but to talk primarily about our own work. So I haven't got huge critiques of what Andy has said, but I do want to unpack a few of the implications of what he's said. But really what I want to do is to make two key points about other things that are going on in the broader structural context that Andy sketched out. The first thing I want to say is that what's happening in the relationship between young people and work, I think, is not merely that young people's employment conditions are deteriorating and getting worse, although that is happening. What I want to say is that young people, the nature of labour itself as a practice that we do when we turn up to work has changed fundamentally in those parts of the economy that young people are overrepresented in, and those parts of the economy that are also increasingly critical to the economies of Western capitalist societies. This is, the term the new economy describes not just a more precarious labour market, but the emergence of forms of work that require new modes of effective investment in work and a new relationship between work and subjectivity. And this effective investment is critical to work in the most precarious sectors of the economy, such as, for example, the urban nighttime economy of big cities like Melbourne. At the same time as this is going on, what I'm going to argue is that youth and youthfulness has become an economic concern. Youth and youthfulness is now constituted economically. That is, youth and youthfulness is now something that is performed in the practice of labour itself and is inserted into processes of value creation in the contemporary economy. Another way of saying that is that being young is valuable, for employers, having young workers is valuable in sectors of the economy that value youthfulness. Anyway, I'll unpack that in a bit. So, As Peter and Steve mentioned, I'm on a fellowship, but what happens when you get one of those is that you immediately start getting interested in everything else other than what you're funded to go and look at. And I'm going to focus for the next couple of minutes on a project that myself and Steve and a few other colleagues at the University of Newcastle are doing on a notion which is becoming increasingly influential in economic sociology and labour studies, which is the notion of effective labour. And the notion of effective labour basically describes a shift in what labour means now. Rather than the creation of a good or a product which is then alienated from the worker, a la Marx, effective labour is labour that involves the performance of subjectivities and personal relationships and the productions of feelings, sensations, or moods. In that respect, subjectivity is not something that young people just bring to work, it's something that they do at work, and work itself is productive of who they are. Not only that, but what they make at work is relationships and feelings and identities. And this is particularly clear in the urban nighttime economy, for example, in the bars and restaurants that the young people that Steve and I have been recently talking to work in. The urban nighttime economy is economically critical to contemporary capitalist societies, and what this economy does is it offers sensations to patrons of bars and restaurants. It offers tastes, embodied states, modes of consumption. It offers feelings of pleasure and fun and enjoyment. And young people who work in the urban nighttime economy consider their jobs to be the provision of this experience, this sensation in the people who come into the bars that they work in. You know, people go to bars to have a good time, and the point of working in a bar, say these young people, is to provide that pleasure. So we had one young person who said, look, a chimp can pour a beer. What I'm here to do is bring the party effectively. That's kind of their job, right? The work is facilitating enjoyment and creating an atmosphere in a bar. What was really interesting about this was that the way that this is done and the way that this is described blurs the boundaries between labour and leisure in young people's lives. So many of these young people who are doing ultra precarious jobs, where if they don't pick up more shifts next week, they won't be able to pay their rent, described going to work in terms of socialising with friends, having a few drinks behind the bar, dancing behind the bar sometimes when the bar was a particularly fun place to be working, and interacting with patrons in such a way that they enjoyed and in such a way as to create a sense of enjoyment in the people who were in the bar. So this has a number of implications. First of all, it unpacks the idea that these are low-skilled jobs, because what young people here are doing, they have to deploy an enormous range of social skills in order to create these embodied sensations and pleasures in the people they interact with, particularly, for instance, young women who are often having to deal with like sexual harassment and the kind of perennial problem of drunk men that we have just in the world. So these aren't really unskilled jobs, even though the skills that they require are not recognised. The second thing, as I say, is that the relationship between labour and leisure here is blurred in terms of the practice of labour itself. So one of the things, what makes a great bar worker is in a sense the same thing as what makes someone the life of the party. And being able to bring that experience to patrons in the bar is not something that you can learn at university or TAFE. So bar work was described as physically and emotionally demanding and exhausting, but it was also described as enormously pleasurable and as critical to young people's social lives. And in many respects, the social lives of young people and their working lives intermesh to the point where sometimes there is no distinction. We interviewed a participant recently who talked about the fact that in many respects his sex life was contingent on flirting with young women as he was working, right? So there's a sense in which the boundary between who you are at work and the boundary between who you are outside of work is blurred. Not only that, but the blurring of that boundary is critical to the labour performed, and it's also of enormous value to the employer who wants a fun employee. So young people invite their friends to the bars. As they work, they hang out with their friends. Sometimes their friends might buy them a drink and they'll have a few drinks behind the bar. Young people often describe a strong personal identification with the places that they work as well. They like them and they like being in there. So even though in the terms of that Andy described before, these are lousy jobs, they have an extremely critical role in these young people's day-to-day lives, and they involve unique forms of pleasure and sociality that blur the boundaries between work and leisure. So moving sort of away from that effective labour project as such, but I think continuing some of these things, one of the things that I want to argue is that, in the contemporary service economy, labour is becoming increasingly aestheticised and embodied. It's very much about performing a particular kind of body and performing a particular kind of subjectivity in order to create a response and a relationship with the person who's there. This is Linda McDowell who's kind of sketching out the role of youth, of young bodies and of youthfulness in this economy. And what she says is ugly, fat, non-white, elderly bodies are inadmissible in societies that valorise an idealised white, slim, young, unwrinkled, typically heterosexualised body, and so such bodies are out of place in the interactive sales industries, occupations that increasingly dominate in advanced industrial societies. So youthful bodies are valued, and the practices that young people perform in order to cultivate their bodies become, in a sense, labour. So when a young woman who is hired by a bar, partially because she is young and attractive, gets up, gets dressed, does whatever it is that she does in order to kind of look how she wants to look when she leaves the house, That is labour, even before she has turned up to work. And the cultivation of that youthful body is of value. It makes value, in fact. Not only that, but young people and youthfulness is often associated with particular kinds of cool and taste that are enormously valuable in metropolitan service economies. So we've got the commodification of youth subcultures and scenes, in which music scenes and the like are commodified and turned into sources of value. Young people are also often positioned as consumers as they work. Many bars and fashion retail outlets will hire workers from their consumers. They will approach people who go there and buy things or who drink there to work there because they want someone who's going to identify with the bar and be able to reflect the kind of image that the bar wants to sell and the experience that the bar wants its patrons to have. And they know they'll be able to do that because the person who works at the bar also parties at the bar and knows how to do that effectively. So young people often, when we spoke to them in the Affective Labour Project, talked about work from the perspective of a consumer, about whether or not the drinks in the bar were nice. Was it a nice place for people to hang out? Could you dance? Was the music good? Rather than from the perspective of their employment conditions at all. So what I want to suggest here is that youthfulness, or the particular kind of youthfulness that's associated with cultural cool and edginess and savvy, now contributes to the production of profit in a way that implicates the entire subjectivities and the entire life worlds of young people. So the last thing I would want to suggest here is that any of this is liberating, but it's complicated. There's pleasures involved. There's enormous personal investments that keep these young people coming back to work every day. And so I think taken together, what we've seen across all of the presentations today is a fundamental reorganisation of the relationship between work, employment and youth, in which the capacity to navigate labour market precarity is becoming increasingly significant as young people themselves become increasingly critical to the operation of contemporary metropolitan service economies. Thank you.
As I indicated, one of the reasons that we also asked Andy to be here tonight was to launch our new book, Kerry, my new book, and Andy is the editor of the series in which the book appears, and he's going to say a few words that I hope are really nice, and then I'll say a few words.
Okay, thanks, Peter. You take a risk there, but probably a good one. I know what's what. And Kerry up here. Do you want to come down? No? Okay. My very great pleasure tonight to help launch this new book with the same cover in the same series as the one I talked about earlier. Young people in the aesthetics of health promotion, beyond reason, rationality and risk. And I'm delighted to be the one to launch the book for a number of reasons. First, it's one of the books in the series I edit for Routledge, and we're building up a really good collection of books, and Peter and Kerry's book really add to that. It also has books in the series over here too, so I mean they're all really coming through thick and fast in what promises to be a fantastic series, and really helped get off to a fantastic start by this great book by Kerry and Peter. Secondly, I've known Peter for many years. I think he's reminded me how many, certainly from the days when he looked more like Father Ted than he does today. I was the external examiner for Peter's thesis and Kerry's thesis, so I think there's a connection all around there. Two excellent pieces of work to kick off along a path to something good. For Peter, it's one book among many good ones out there, and for Kerry, I think it's a first, but a fantastic marker. So third, obviously pleased to launch this because it is an absolutely excellent book that deserves to be read by anyone with an interest in young people, particularly those with an interest in health promotion. But even if that isn't your interest, I think this book makes some very fine contributions on a theoretical level. And I think you can, in a sense, health promotion, as it comes across in the book, can be regarded in its broadest sense, but can be thought of as a sort of vehicle through which a range of theoretical ideas are explored and developed. So contributions coming across on a whole number of levels there. I'll read from the synopsis. So Peter is going to expand in a little while. It reads, health promotion with young people has largely been framed by theories of behaviour change to target unsafe, unhealthy and or risky behaviours. These series and models seek to encourage the development in young people of reasoned, rational and risk-aware personal strategies. This book presents an innovative and critical perspective on young people and health promotion. It explores the limits and possibilities of traditional health behaviour change models with their focus on reason, risk and rationality by examining the embodied dimensions of meaning making in health promotion programmes. Drawing on an array of critical social theories and approaches to knowledge production, the authors identify and engage the aesthetic and affective dimensions of young people's engagement with issues such as road safety, sexualities, alcohol and drug use, and physical mental health and well-being. It has a whole lot of things, and I'm sure there are areas in that each and every one of you are interested in, as well as the theoretical dimensions. So, get your wallets out. It's an excellent book, worth investing in. If you find with a hardback, the hardback is the only one out now. If your wallet won't stretch to it now, and Peter will be very pleased if it will, do order it for your library, and do make a note that the paperback edition I'll be following not far behind, and that's certainly worth investing in. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I just want to say a few words in a bit more detail about the book and what it was that we were trying to do, and hopefully it won't keep you too long. So the book itself actually had its origins in Kerry's PhD research that I supervised while I was at Monash University. And it was based, the work that Andy's outlined, is based in a detailed examination of a school-based road safety health promotion intervention that was called Fit to Drive. And Kerry and a number of her colleagues here tonight, which is great, were instrumental in developing and delivering this project or program over the last 15 years or so. And Fit to Drive is a road safety program for students in years 10, 11 and 12 of secondary school, and it had its beginnings in about 2002 in a small school community that was reeling from the loss of 7 young lives in a period of 18 months. And the central feature of the program is a half-day workshop for Year 11 students that brings together an array of agencies such as Victoria Police and the Metropolitan Fire Brigade to support, and I quote Kerry here, to support young people to make positive choices in relation to driving and road use by raising awareness in young people of a variety of risks. And so at this point in time, I think there's Fit to Drive operates in over 220 schools around Victoria. As Andy indicates, we move from an initial analysis of Fit to Drive to say something more general about the embodied and the aesthetic dimensions of meaning making in health promotion with young people. As he said, we move to look at what lies beyond, if you like, somewhere beyond reason, rationality and risk in these programs. And we said that these are the 3 R's that are largely about cognitive skills and processes and not so much about emotions, feelings, embodiment or aesthetics. And much of what we tried to do was framed by the idea that all, and in capital letters, all educational strategies and interventions are undertakings with purpose. And that specific purposes and contexts guide choices and decisions about what to include, that is, what to make present, what to explicitly exclude, that is, what to make manifestly absent. And in making these choices about including certain things and leaving others out, some things will not explicitly enter our ways of thinking. But if we look again, think again, then we can see them. And we call these things that are absent as other. And so throughout the book, we discuss the ways in which the 3 R's, reason, rationality and risk, often make emotions, feelings, embodiment and aesthetics absent, manifestly or as other, in school-based health promotion programs. And it's something about the reality of how schools work, classes, timetables, curriculum areas, educational and curriculum policy, that create powerful needs to contain and to constrain, to enclose emotions, feelings, embodiment, aesthetics. Our sense was that the tragic dimensions of young people's death and injury as a result of car crashes and the ways in which these dimensions structure Fit to Drive provided a powerful way for us to think about these concerns, what's included, what's excluded. For example, we discuss how at a fundamental level Fit to Drive is a school-based health promotion program that is shaped by death, by the tragic dimensions of young deaths, lives cut short, and by families and communities traumatised by deaths. But in being shaped by death, Fit to Drive, as a school-based health promotion intervention, can only approach the problem of death and of life in a particular way. So at one point in the book, we look at the problem of death in a number of ways that move beyond the tragic, as we called it, or as we identified it. Not to lessen the tragic dimensions of lives cut short, but to think about other dimensions of death and life and what place, if any, these may have in school-based health promotion. There are, we argued, social and cultural dimensions to the ways we imagine and talk about death. How do we deal differently with different deaths? Is it more tragic if the victim, the young person, is popular or pretty or clever, able or disabled? Is the death of Jill Maher, for example, more tragic than the death of the St Kilda sex worker who was murdered on the same night that Jill was murdered? There are economic dimensions to death, to the problem of dying. What price of life? What costs is a community prepared to bear in relation to safety and risks of harm and death? There are always also political dimensions to death and dying. Do some lives matter more than others? This is a conclusion that is far too easy to draw in looking in too many places throughout human history. Hashtag Black Lives Matter. Hashtag All Lives Matter. Increasingly, there are also biotechnological dimensions to life, dying and death that take on new characteristics in 21st century biogenetic capitalism. What are the limits of life, of death? When does life start? When does life end? When does death occur? How much biotechnology should be deployed to start life, to prolong life, to stave off, even deny death? There are also ethical dimensions. What is a good life? A good death? Who or what determines these? And there are religious dimensions. What comes next? What is the purpose of life? And of course, there are the much more mundane dimensions of death, though no less important in their everyday nature. The sense of loss, of grief, of sadness, of relief, of peace even, of rest that are experienced at the deeply personal level by partners and lovers, parents, sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, friends and colleagues of the person who has died, tragically or in other ways. Our aim in doing this, and the other work we do in the book, is not to find fault or to pass judgment on any particular intervention or program. Rather, we want to open up conversations about many of the orthodoxies that shape working with young people, to think about what our answers are when we ask, what can we do when we do health promotion with young people? We don't expect, as Andy just suggested, for you to rush out and buy copies. If you've seen the flyer, you'll see how expensive it is, but do please pass the word around and ask your library to buy copies. And there will be a hardback, a paperback in 12 months, and quite possibly Kerry will be happy to autograph those copies for you. And finally, before we retire and have a drink and something to eat, we and Kerry in particular would like to acknowledge the many people, some who are named, most unnamed in the book. The educators, the student facilitators, the community workers, the workers from areas as diverse as fire services, local government, Vic Police, who have, through their dedication, collegiality, mutual support and care most often for all young people, care most of all for young people, have constituted the heart of the Fit to Drive community. And she is really indebted to those people, as I said, that she names, but others that she doesn't name. So thank you, and thank you for making the effort to come out tonight. Thank you for listening to our presenters. and we hope to join you out at the front of the foyer for a drink before you go. Thank you.